Hi everyone. Good afternoon, everyone.
It feels like it was like a year ago.
Hi everyone.
Hi.
So hi everyone. My name is Aaliyah Ranjit and I'm an assistant professor. Now you can hear me. Hi everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Aaliyah Ranjit and I'm an assistant professor in the Africana Studies Department and the Caribbean Studies program. And I'm very honored and excited to welcome you to today's event. So this is the sixth in an 8-part series we are hosting to celebrate recent books by Brooklyn College faculty. And today we celebrate Swapna N. Banerjee's latest book, Fathers in the Motherland, Imagining Fatherhood in Colonial India. Can we give her a round of applause? So 2 quick announcements, please. Here we go. Can we see the book again? Yay! So 2 quick announcements. First, this event is being recorded, and the recording will be posted on the Wolf Institute's YouTube channel. And second, if you are a student and you're here as part of a class, and of course, thank you for professors for bringing your classes here today. So if you did not sign in, please be sure to sign in on your way out. So let's introduce today's speakers. So Swapna M. Banerjee is a professor of South Asian history at Brooklyn College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. She's the author of Men, Women, and Domestics, Articulating Middle-Class Identity in Colonial Bengal, 2004, and of the book we celebrate today, Fathers in a Motherland, Imagining Fatherhood in Colonial India, 2022, both from Oxford University Press. She is also a co-editor of the volume Mapping Women's History, Recovery, Resistance, and Activism in Colonial and Post-Colonial India. Banerjee's current research, supported by the Australian Research Council, is on traveling native female caregivers, or ayahs, from India to Great Britain, Australia, and other parts of the British Empire. Banerjee's Fathers in the Motherland contends that during a period of social and political change in the late 19th and early 20th century colonial India, fathers extended their roles beyond breadwinning to take an active part in rearing their children. The book interrogates the connections between fatherhood and masculinity and argues that biological and imaginary fathers assumed the moral guardianship of an incipient nation and rested their hopes and dreams in the future generation. As we were thinking about today's celebration of Professor Banerjee's book, we decided that it would be great to invite 2 scholars whose recent books also interrogate cultural manifestations of masculinity. Professor G.N. Pandey and his book Fragments of Family, Men at Home in Colonial and Post-Colonial India, who is with us via Zoom. Welcome. And Professor Ren Capitone's Brotherhood of Barristers, A Cultural History of the British Legal Profession, 1840 to 1940. Professor G.N. Pandey, who joins us today via Zoom, is Arts and Sciences Distinguished Professor at Emory University, where he's also director of the Interdisciplinary Workshop on Colonial and Post-Colonial Studies. A founding member and leading theorist of the Subaltern Studies Project, Pandey's research focuses on South Asia and the USA. Among his works are A History of Prejudice, Race, Caste, and Difference in India and the United States, 2013, Routine Violence, Nations, Fragments, Histories, 2006, The Construction of Communalism in Colonial North India, 2006, and Remembering Partition, Violence, Nationalism and History in India, 2001. He has edited 3 major anthologies, Subaltern Citizens and Their Histories, Investigations from India and the USA, Subalternity and Difference, Investigations from the North and South, and Unarchived Histories, The Mad and the Trifling. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor Pandey. Ren Capitone is an assistant professor of history at New York University. Their research focuses on gender and culture in modern Britain and its empire. Their first monograph, Brotherhood of Barristers, A A Cultural History of the British Legal Profession, 1840 to 1940, reapproaches the history of the Inns of Court, the four legal societies that governed the upper half of the British bar. The book charts the society's success at maintaining an exclusive masculine culture, even while seeming from the outside to concede sweeping social changes across the 19th and 20th centuries. So we thank you both for being here with us today to share your work and, of course, your expertise. And now, of course, is the most important part. I shall turn the mic over to Professor Banerjee. It is all yours.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Gaston. Thank you, Alia. And thank you, Kiana and the Wolf Institute for making this gathering possible. It is my great pleasure to be a part of a panel around my book that also brings in two other great scholars in the field with comparable and like-minded interests. I would just spend a minute talking about the present situation, which I can't help. We are poised at a moment that will go down in history as a period that welcomed strong and toxic masculinity in the US. As an institution and a reading group, we have been following Melissa Murray's...
Excuse me. Is it possible just to speak a little louder?
Okay.
I hear you, but not as clearly as I'd like.
Okay, sure, thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Okay,
Thanks.
thanks, Dan. I wanted to just reflect a little bit on the current moment and what we are doing as an institution. We are poised at a moment when we are dealing with the emblem of a strong man and a toxic masculinity. And as an institution and as a reading group, we have been following Melissa Murray's work on the jurisprudence of masculinity. Referring to the Supreme Court's decision in October 2021 on the evisceration of Roe versus Wade, Planned Parenthood of Southeastern Pennsylvania versus Casey, and the constitutional right of abortion, Melissa Murray has argued, and I quote, "The court has prioritized and privileged male rights and the men who seek to exercise them. In so doing, the Roberts Court has quietly sown the seeds of a jurisprudence of masculinity that prioritizes and protects men and their rights, even as it continues and consigns women and their rights to the uncertainties of a distorted modernity and democracy." End quote. So moving away from the US scene, our panel seeks to understand how the jurisprudence of masculinity was configured outside the realms of judiciary and the so-called public domain, of the present. Our focus is the everyday and the ordinary that unfolded in familial domains and in certain privileged institutions that were major sites of interactions, counteractions, and performance of elite and non-elite men. So these are the three words we are looking at. We cast a wider net and trace 200 years of history by attending to the social and cultural prejudices and practices that constituted the affective components of manhood in colonial and post-colonial India, Victorian Britain, and beyond. Collectively, we deal with the British Empire, and the dark spots that we see on the map belong to the British Empire in the 19th century. So collectively, we study how our historical subjects, fathers in my case, barristers for Pepitone, and educated men straddling different strata in late colonial and post-colonial India for Professor Pandey, they became invested in particular structures, ideological productions, and in creating a sense of entitlement and privileges. In short, our works show how men at home and how the British barristers in the Inns of Court in Victorian England were instrumental in creating enduring relations of power through affective designations as fathers, as brothers, husbands, and writers. By underscoring the home in the world and the world in the home, to borrow a phrase from Professor Pandey's work, we explore the strengths and vulnerabilities of men in multi-layered power relationships that unraveled in fatherly, brotherly, and spousal relationships. Although focused on different locales and time periods, our works converge on how men legitimize their authority and entitlements on the basis of certain behaviors and practices, the most important criteria of which was respectability. So here, I show a map of the United Kingdom and India, which was its jewel in the crown, the largest colony. But our works are connected, as we will see as we speak. Contrary to the popular belief of strong men with strong bodies, the signifiers of masculinity for the men we study were courage, fearlessness, filial piety, self-control, honesty, work ethic, and specific principles and ideologies. The Indian poet Rabindranath Tagore, who was often quoted for his alternate definition of masculinity, gave a clarion call for Indians whose mind would be, and I quote, without fear and the head held high. So let me now turn to show how my book, Fathers in the Motherland, addresses the question of manhood through the figure of the father. After me, Professor Pepitone will talk about her book, followed by Professor Pandey, because we follow a chronological order. I go back in time, and at the end, we will engage in a more detailed and intimate discussion of how our works intersect and diverge. My book, Fathers in the Motherland, Imagining Fatherhood in Colonial India, weaves stories of fathers and children into a history of gender, family, and nation in colonial India, that is from 1757 to 1947. So this is the map. I argue that fatherhood, just like newly conceived models of motherhood and mothercraft, assumed new meaning and significance in the changing society and culture of colonial India. During this time of social and political change, new norms were defined to extend the parameters of fatherhood. Fathers extended their roles beyond breadwinning to take an active part in rearing and socialization of their children. But there were differences in fathers' attitude toward boys and girls. So fatherhood differed depending on the gender of the child. Most importantly, my study demonstrates how fatherhood was tied to the self-fashioning of educated Indian men and their conception of masculinity and manliness. As a historian, my sources are pedagogic literature, scientific journals, autobiographies, essays, and correspondences to understand the different ways the authority and power of the father was invoked and constituted metaphorically and in everyday interactions. So, my work is set primarily in colonial Bengal, which also housed the imperial capital in the city of Calcutta. It centers on the upwardly mobile, higher caste, reformed Hindu communities, broadly termed as respectable gentlemen, who led progressive social reforms concerning women, children, and family in 19th and 20th century India. As products of colonial education and working with the British administration on different levels, these gentlemen were conversant with post-Enlightenment liberal thoughts, and as modern individuals, they were instrumental in translating concepts that traversed both the West and the East. In their march towards modernity and progress, they creatively assimilated their Indian past and traditional practices. I describe these upper caste, educated Indian men as fathers to their own children and as fathers to an imagined community of children of an emerging nation. I contend that as fathers, both ideological, biological, and imaginary, they assumed a moral guardianship of an incipient nation and rested their hopes and despair in the future generation. The book explores specific moments in colonial Indian history when educated men as biological fathers, as well as literary activists and educators, assumed guardianship and became crucial agents of change. These male intellectuals were among the first to question traditional social customs and envision new models of womanhood, family, children, nation, and I argue, new ideas of fatherhood as well. This educated community took the middle class child to be the future citizen subject, if male, and to be the good mother and housewife, if female. A close reading of the sources reveals that these male writers were also asserting themselves as fathers, pita, in Sanskrit, to use the Sanskrit or Hindi terminology, they both in their biological capacity and as moral guardians of a new nation. So my book works, of course, as a work of history, works in tandem with the leading historiography in the field. So recent scholarship has deliberated on South Asia, has deliberated on questions of colonial masculinity, the constitution of patriarchy, and the heterogeneous and paradoxical nature of the Indian middle class, comprised of this gentleman that I'm talking about. The research for this book made me particularly sensitive to the multiple layers of subalternity and the widening definitions of masculinity. The British colonial discourse described Indian males, and I quote, Lilliputian in size, morally depraved, weak, and feeble. In the language of the famous British law member Thomas Babington Macaulay, the Bengalis in particular were, and I again quote, feeble even to effeminacy, end quote, and were weak, again I quote, even to helplessness of women. The Bengali men, routinely identified with the frailty of women and the powerlessness of submissive slaves, they reacted to this criticism. The response that this critique generated was two-pronged. One, on the one hand, they had internalized this criticism, but on the other, they used this critique as a springboard to launch their challenge against the colonial regime. My work seizes this moment of counteraction by the colonial elites when they articulated their messages to children through vernacular textbooks, primers, didactic texts, and children's magazines, the major literary genres in 19th century India. Instead of looking at the public spheres and events where masculinity of Indian and British men were debated, I steer our gaze from the public debates and controversies to the more personal realms of family life. I locate these fathers as modern subjects, as family men, whose masculinity was constituted by their intellectual and affective relationships with their children, both biological and imaginary, rather than via heteronormative relationships based on muscular strength and as breadwinners. Their power as social reformers emanated from their being leaders of a vulnerable community, which they attempted to salvage by educating future citizens with new sense and sensibilities. So my story is about subjugated Indian men who were also asserting themselves as authorities and as paternal authorities who would lead the nation to a better future. So these men who were also comprised the educated intelligentsia turned the critique of Indian masculinity on its head by shifting its focus from denigration of Indians to a sharp rebuttal of colonial education. Iconic leaders such as Tagore, Gandhi, and Nehru claimed that it was colonial education that emasculated Indian men. Through selective acceptance and partial disavowal of colonial education, Indian men sought to reclaim themselves with their future generation. The father figures emphasized character building and fearlessness to face the onslaught of the marauding modernity and the oppressive colonial regime. They urged it was by observing filial piety, by being fearless and holding heads high, that the new generations of Indian citizens, read boys, would respond, would react. They also emphasized education that would carry them through their life. So it was through new education, a new pedagogy that they professed side by side with the colonial curriculum and the message of fearlessness that these Indian intelligentsia harnessed the power of children. So my work in the book stresses the alternate pedagogy that challenged colonial notions of manliness and masculinity. It reveals that physical strength and public debates were not the only components of masculinity. Masculinity for Indian men manifested in practices of everyday life, and it worked through inhabiting certain roles and positions contingent on relational and kinship hierarchy, caring for and commanding subaltern members, and showing respect to elders. I contend that in late colonial India, educated Indian men's quest for moral guardianship was an expression of their masculinity that spoke through their emotions of affection and care, disciplining and punishment, and through a novel vision of an education of their desire. The fatherly concerns exhibited by the authors for building the character of children envisage a new moral order encompassing proper training of mind and body that was crucial for building a robust national culture. In this new discourse, children, a gendered yet otherwise undifferentiated category in terms of class, caste, and religion, were conceived as victims, but at the same time as agents of change. The harnessing of children as enabling agents signaled a counter-hegemonic effort by the intelligentsia to articulate its autonomous epistemic space as moral guardians of a new nation and its nebulous citizenry. I examine not so much the lives of children, but the ways the ideas of class-specific and gendered childhood were appropriated and mobilized by a powerful literati inhabiting the colonial state. At the heart of this discourse lay implicitly or explicitly the question of free citizenry based on ideas of self-reliance and self-determination, thus unsettling the boundaries of the home and the world. My book is a study of multi-layered power relationship that inflected subjective identities of Indian men with relation to an imagined community of children. Interestingly, none of the fathers I discussed, or none of the leaders I discussed, were perfect fathers or successful educators. In fact, a majority of them had vexed relationship with their children and often with their own fathers. Their everyday practices as biological fathers and intergenerational relationships only disclose their limitations. Yet they harbored a global vision for the future generation. In the process of unraveling this struggle, what becomes apparent are the vulnerabilities, ambivalences, and contradictions that beset the virtual fathers of modern India, a hallmark that underscores subjects of modernity in any other context. Thank you. Now goes to Professor Pepitone, and I kind of
great, thank
drew up this map for you, and the next one is your book.
Okay,
Good luck.
thank you. How is the volume on this? Gyan, are you able to hear me? Okay, great, perfect. Thank you all for being here, and to Professor Banerjee for inviting me. I can imagine as the introductions were going on that some of you were perhaps wondering why this person who seems to be trained in British history and is working on legal institutions is here on this panel about effective masculinities and Indian masculinities in particular. And I promise if you bear with me, all will become clear. So for the 5 centuries leading up to women's admission to the British bar in 1919, law was an exclusively male occupation with a culture that emphasized eating, drinking, and fraternization in the truest meaning of the word. Most of the existing studies of the British bar prior to my book take these homosocial aspects as incidental. And my book, by contrast, Brotherhood of Barristers, makes 3 critical interventions. So firstly, I place masculinity as a central category of analysis in the study of the profession. I insist that masculinity was not incidental, but in fact instrumental to professional, or rather to legal culture. Secondly, I take sociality seriously, particularly in relation to professional success or failure. I argue that success as a lawyer was first and foremost predicated not on legal learning, but on everyday performances of a professional masculinity that fused Victorian strictures of gentlemanliness with historicist fraternal practices. And lastly, while I examine strategies that marginalized groups deployed to navigate the dominant culture of the profession, I also pay careful attention to strategies that legal institutions deployed to maintain the status quo, because these strategies were on the whole successful. So I'm interested in enduring conservatism over time and what undergirds that process. Okay, so before I say more about masculinity and professional culture, I want to take a moment to explain the peculiarities of the bar and also make a case for why a focus on the legal profession allows me to speak to a broader context than it at first may seem. So Britain had a split legal profession. Solicitors interacted with clients, and barristers, who were better remunerated and considered more prestigious, pleaded cases in court. They're the ones with the wigs on, if you've ever seen like a British legal drama. So to qualify as a barrister, no matter where you wish to practice, whether it's Britain or in the Empire, and no matter whether or not you held a university law degree, and this is pretty much true with the exception of a handful of white settler colonies, so like initially Ireland and then Canada and Australia, but pretty much anywhere else in the Empire. You had to join one of 4 legal societies known as the Inns of Court, right? So these are 4 institutions in central London. They have a strange name, but they are neither hotels nor law courts. They were instead guild-like professional associations. They required students to put down a £100 deposit and spend 3 years keeping term in their central London dining halls before being called to the bar. Keeping term was done by eating dinner, and I'll come to that later on. So on the one hand, my book is extremely geographically specific, right? I'm looking at these 4 institutions concentrated in the center of Britain's capital, right? We're talking like maybe 20 acres of land tops. On the other hand, even if a man lived in Madras and wished to practice law in Madras, that man still had to go to the inns in London first to qualify. The inns thus had a centripetal effect, drawing in students from Stevenage to Shanghai. Especially when speaking to audiences in the US, some people try to ask if there's like an American equivalent to this, and there really isn't one. But if you wanted to imagine, it would be like if people from 1/5 of the world's landmass had to go to Washington, D.C. and eat dinner there for 3 years before they could be lawyers. That's the kind of best equivalent I could imagine. So not only do we have this centripetal effect, but the Inns of Court were also a pipeline to the judiciary and to certain parliamentary and cabinet positions, to say nothing of colonial bureaucracy. So thus my book's focus actually encompasses a global geography, and it extends its conclusions from those who practice law to those who made and adjudicated it. So, in fact, quite far reach. Oh, great, yeah, thank you. I posited that a Victorian culture of gentlemanliness, sociality, and historicism dominated the bar well into the 20th century because of the resulting form of embodied masculinity that came to be synonymous with what it meant to be a barrister. And so in the first half of my talk today, I will unpack the logics behind these pillars of legal culture and explain how they created the norms of the profession. Most critically, I argue that the culture of the bar had an affective dimension. At the bar, barristers and law students engaged in fraternal rhetoric and praxis, describing themselves as, quote, a brotherhood of barristers. In this phrase, brotherhood was both a metaphor, lawyers were like kin, and an affective designation. Lawyers should feel for one another the warmth, loyalty, and fundamental similarity of siblings, right? So an affective designation that we don't usually associate with the workplace, right? This idea of brotherhood. To inculcate members with this sense of fraternity, as well as with the priorities of the legal profession, the societies relied on socialization with older generations rather than formal training and examination. In letters, diaries, and memoirs, barristers defined legal culture as one in which men studied together in the library, chatted in the common room, drilled with the volunteer rifle corps in the garden, and most importantly, dined together in hall. This latter practice attempted to instill a sense of brotherhood in members by enacting a series of formal rituals of medieval origin, revived or reemphasized, at least imagined medieval origin, by Victorian societies. So if you can imagine, you have these rows of men dressed in their black gowns, kind of like Harry Potter style gowns, proceeding into hall 2 by 2. They then broke into groups of 4 and shared a meal of roast meats and wine. And I cannot emphasize enough that not only was dining mandatory, but that for much of the 19th century, dining in hall was the only requirement to become a barrister, right? You don't have to take classes, you don't have to take exams, you do have to eat dinner. Eventually, these societies faced some pressure from outside the profession, from Parliament to reform a little bit, and so they instated optional classes, some nominal examinations, and a few other gestures towards equipping some degree of legal learning and expertise in their students. But almost all of those educational efforts came with loopholes so that students could still kind of avoid having to take exams and classes. There are no loopholes to avoid dining in hall. Okay, so there are many ways to interpret the rituals of dining at the end. Some fell into the category of invented tradition that historians like Eric Hobsbawm outlined that promoted social cohesion, institutional authority, and that socialized members into a particular value system. Other historians have suggested that they ensured all law students underwent identical rites of passage and created a kind of professional solidarity and outlook. Certainly, mid-Victorian barristers and members of the profession, despite critiques that dining was a way to become gastronomically learned in the law, high-ranking members of the bar insisted that the advantage of social intercourse that students accrued from dining was essential, that young barristers and law students could connect with older members of the profession, that the hall was a space to reinforce what students had learned from their law books and their tutors. But I want to add to this, I don't disagree with any of these interpretations, but I want to add an affective dimension of these rituals. In fact, some of the practices that went on had quite intimate connotations, perhaps none more so than the tellingly named loving cup. So in this ceremony, a single goblet of a mysterious Elizabethan recipe would be passed around, and the person drinking it would be flanked on either side by members to guard them. And so they would all drink from the same cup and then take turns passing it along. And so if we imagine what men underwent during this ceremony, dozens of men stood in close proximity, they placed their mouths on the same vessel, they exchanged trace amounts of body fluids, they activated their senses of taste, of touch, and of smell. So historians of Victorian clubs or secret societies, which are also homosocial spaces, argue that motive rituals provided solace from the hyper-rational world of the market. But rituals at the Inns of Court united effective and professional practice, marking the legal profession as distinct from the world of speculation and capitalist enterprise. The distinction between the world of the inns and that of the market was particularly important because by the 19th century, the notion of what it meant to be a gentleman was changing. Elite men whose respectability had been tied to land, to leisure, and classical learning did not disappear, but increasingly they coexisted with those who made their fortunes via commercial or speculative capitalism. And that meant that the class breakdown of the legal profession was changing. So in the 18th century, you had a lot of sons of the aristocracy that would be at these institutions, using them almost like a finishing school. But by the 19th century, the sons of the professional and commercial middle classes were increasingly able to access these institutions. And so to retain their elite character, the inns doubled down on older notions of gentlemanliness. They did this by prohibiting barristers from engaging in commercial trade or advertising their services, for example. And then gentlemanliness was also about a set of relationships, how one man related to another, and so the ability to get on with one's fellows and to be both honest and respectful were also important qualities for the successful barrister. So, having laid out these aspects of culture, we can now think that, okay, these same historic spaces like the dining halls and the traditions and rituals that went on inside of them that marked insider status for some members, equally denoted outsider status for other members, particularly overseas students, women, and political radicals. And for the second half of the talk today, I want to focus on the spatial politics of difference at the Inns of Court, particularly in relation to Indian students. I promised the connection would get there eventually, who represented the largest group of overseas members throughout the period of my study, right? So you have students coming from all over Britain's empire, but Indian students are coming in the hundreds and thousands, low thousands, like 1,000, 2,000 per year, in part because at the start of the Raj, there's an impetus to integrate more Indian subjects into colonial bureaucracies, right? And so there's more impetus for them to do things like study at inns. And so by taking this focus on overseas students, I'm trying to bridge gaps between scholarship that privileges the activities of the governing elite and work that takes the interactions of the home, street, school, or club as loci of imperial power. So the Inns of Court fed imperial hierarchies and faced pressure and scrutiny from the government, particularly the India office, to make sure that they adequately disciplined their imperial members. The societies were also sites of work and learning. You have day-to-day interactions between English and imperial subjects at the inns that tested the elasticity of the society's fraternal culture. The inns expected all Indian and generally overseas students to conform to the dominant culture and met unique religious, sumptuary, dietary, and cultural needs with limited forms of accommodation. So when Gandhi is there, for example, he's keeping term and finding petitions to be fed something more than bread and boiled potatoes, and the societies kind of agree that is a reasonable request. At the same time, for several decades, the inns were seemingly mystified that what they described as home and overseas students did not, quote, intermix socially, right? And we know that socialization has a much greater weight on it than it might in some contexts. In fact, the stakes were manifold both for the societies and for the students themselves. So in practical terms, traditions like dining in hall were meant to provide junior members of the bar with an opportunity to interact with senior counsel. Table talk could serve tutorial functions or lead to future employment. Students excluded from socialization faced serious disadvantage. But by the turn of the century, right, so around 1900, success or failures of socialization took on yet another meaning because the societies came to distrust the potentially radical politics of their overseas members. Right, so this is a moment where the Indian nationalist movement has been ongoing up until this period, but we get to a moment where there's a divide between members of the Indian National Congress and the formation of what's known as the Hot Faction, which advocated violent measures in order to achieve its goals, right? And so it is absolutely impossible to quantify the actual number of nationalists among law students, let alone those who work hard in a high fashion. But the actions of a prevalent few provoked these societies to fear that rather than upholding the structures of power undergirded by the legal profession, Indian students would work to undermine imperial authority or even bring bodily harm to the Brits around them. And so the societies debated how to best mold imperial subjects. Should they mold them like they molded English barristers through the absorption of culture and the values of profession by a ritual? There's never a concrete answer, but there are decades of debate amongst these four legal societies and conversations with the India office as well that had to do with questions as to should Indian students be brought to be made to study in Britain at all? Is this something that inculcated English values, or was travel to Britain a place where students actually became radicalized, in part because controls over the British press were actually looser than the Indian press, and so there's a much greater opportunity for the circulation of nationalist ideas. There were also debates about the spatial logics of Indian students in the capital, whether students should be forced to live together where they could be monitored closely, or whether they should be forced to live in the homes of English families where they would absorb values and not the contagious, air quotes, but a term used by these thinkers, rhetoric of Indian nationalism. And then, of course, there were also debates as to whether Indian students could be rational, self-regulating gentlemen at all, right? So whether students could be the kind of liberal subjects that the Inns were hoping to create. So despite various misgivings, the Inns of Court never set up formal barriers to prevent Indian students from joining the societies, which was different from, let's say, the universities, which instituted quotas. But instead, these legal societies instituted two covert strategies. They deliberately intervened or abstained from taking action in ways that affected which social organizations and social spaces students could access. And most of those decisions were, again, with that language of contagion in mind to prevent students from herding together. So one example is there was a common room in one of these societies that students could use to take informal meals, to play games of chess, to congregate and talk. And this society prevented all students from using the common room, which was kind of mystifying because it was a subscription fee, and the common room had been losing money, and they needed more people, not fewer, to be using it. But it was revealed later that the idea was that too many Indian students had been gathering in this common room and made it feel as if it was their space, right? And so to prevent Indian students from being there, the society said, well, we just won't have any students at all, right? So it's a policy deliberately designed to exclude Indian students from the space. Other policies, ironically, kept home and overseas students apart, even as the Inns emphasized the importance of social mixing. So, for example, I mentioned earlier there's a volunteer rifle corps that is associated with these institutions, and overseas members were not allowed to join this rifle corps. And so even when Indian students petitioned to be able to, right, the societies said no. And so that was something where it's like, well, this is someone who wants to embrace the pageantry of empire, right? In theory, it is in the British best interest to let them do so, but they did not. The second informal strategy that the Inns deployed to regulate overseas students was to interpret precedent and legal etiquette in ways that excuse the actions of political radicals like English pacifists during the First World War, let's say, but that censored the actions of Indian nationalists, even nationalists like Gandhi, right, who was charged with sedition, but who was not engaging in any kind of violent action. Right, and so you have different, one of the chapters that I have in the book looks at these three different sedition cases and why the societies would have ruled quite differently in each case. In interest in time, I'm happy to kind of return to that during conversation if you want to. Otherwise, I will just end by saying the fact that these societies flexibly interpreted existing rules to suit new geopolitical contexts speaks to one of the major interventions of the book, namely that maintaining the status quo required constant effort on the part of these conservative institutions. And more broadly, I suggest that we gain considerable insight into resistance to change when we consider continuity over time as an active and dynamic process. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Pavitone. I now invite Professor Pandey, who has been waiting patiently on Zoom, to talk about his latest work, Men at Home. Please welcome Professor Pandey.
Thank you very much, Shapna. And thank you to Gaston and Alea and Ren and all of you at Brooklyn College who invited us and made this occasion possible. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Okay. I just want to say that while the others were speaking, the frame froze occasionally and voices broke up. So if that happens, just tell me and I'll wait or whatever is needed. I do want to say what the others have said already, that this seminar and all the presentations in it, in a sense, accidentally, providentially, if you like, serendipitously, accidentally I use Shapna's word from how she came to write this book, accidentally. But all of us, all our presentations in this seminar, accidentally happens at a time when the importance of hidden histories is emphasized to us in the most extraordinary way. The hidden histories which are actually not thought of as histories, the values that people live with, the misogyny and racism and casteism that underlies so much of our behavior in daily life. So much of this is wished away in historical writing as non-institutional, if you like, as natural, a sacred inheritance, necessary inheritance, and therefore not historical. And I think what you've got from Shapna and Ren, and I hope you'll get a little bit from my presentation in my book when it comes, is an attempt to show that in fact the institutions and the practices and the politics and the power are all sustained by these attitudes that are called natural, these conditions that are called natural. And both the speakers before me have emphasized, for example, in thinking about manliness and masculinity and social relations, the importance of respectability, for example, the importance of moral education in the most modern period, in the most recent period, as a statement of patriarchal power, but also of masculinity, of rationality. The importance of homosociality, and in a peculiar way, a sort of suggestion of move from aristocratic values to modern bourgeois, middle-class values, which in fact remains a pretense because, of course, sediments of all the earlier values and claims and demands remain in place. So these histories, it seems to me, and this seminar begins to address that. And you've already heard very important statements about all of that. I'm not sure what I can contribute in the 10 or 12 minutes that I'm allowed, but here's what I'll try and do. I'll just try and say what my book called Men at Home, Imagining Liberation in Colonial and Post-Colonial India, what that book tries to do and how I try to do it. And I'll say it in the broadest ways and then hope that there will be some time for questions. First of all, the title, Men at Home and Imagining Liberation, the subtitle, both speak to what the book is trying to do. It focuses men in the home to ask questions about the imagination of the modern, of the democratic, of the equal, of the good society in colonial and post-colonial India. And it does so by locating men firmly in the home, in domestic space, which they pretend, as Shapna has already said, they pretend is not really their domain. But where they spend most of their time in the modern age, post-industrial age, men and women spend a huge amount of time in the home and are dependent on it, however much they pretend that they are not. And so what I do in the book is I place men firmly in domestic space. I examine in detail their absent presence or presence absence. They are absent even when they are present, in that they don't do very much, but they are present even when they are absent, in that their authority still remains. And the constraints, the demands that they make and that have to be fulfilled remain in place. That that presence, absence, presence, its rationalization and its consequences are what I fundamentally investigate. So that kind of supplements or complements what the others have been speaking about. I also work very hard to make this a study of ordinary people in ordinary homes, in the most ordinary of relationships, which are now talked about all of the time as sacred, as elevated, as particularly, necessary to respectability. The monogamous conjugal relationship of husband and wife in heteronormative terms is what sets the ideal standard. So I focus very much on that and on the details of that relationship. And it yields quite unusual results, I think, because of that focus on what I would suggest to you is the most mundane of locations and the most mundane of relationships. Precisely because they are not normally examined, precisely because they are not thought of as history. These are so natural and so elevated in some of the senses, in the modern, they're sacred in all sorts of ways. And the return to these things in the current elections, the kind of misogyny, the demand that these norms and values and inheritance be preserved is something that we must, it seems to me, all of us are saying, we must address directly and speak to and investigate, asking questions, how these are maintained, how they are perpetuated, how they are smuggled in, even when there is a pretense of change, this kind of thing. One thing I do, which perhaps the others, Ren's book is called upon to do it, and she does it. Shapna doesn't focus on it because she has enough on her hands in trying to deal with moral education and pedagogy as the new masculinity. One thing I do in my book is pay attention to the enormous diversity of conditions in a subcontinent like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh today. In that subcontinent, therefore, I pay attention to men at home, not only amongst elite Muslims and elite Hindus, who are two groupings that I take account of, but amongst the laboring poor, where I focus to a very large extent on the lowest castes and classes, people who were formerly known as untouchables and treated as untouchables. They're not like the American South. They're people who are in Jim Crow conditions, not allowed to walk the same streets, not go to the same schools, not go to any schools, not allowed into the temples, not allowed to drink the same water, etc., etc. And certainly they don't share the same food or social interactions. So domestic space for the laboring poor is obviously very different from what it is for the middle classes or the upper classes. And yet, the peculiar thing is that very often, so I want to just stress one particular thing. For the elite in colonial and post-colonial India, what needed to be changed was the world outside. The world at home was already good. So in a funny way, history is pushed to the outside. It is the formal institutions, the political world, the public sphere, it was as it was called, that needs to be changed. What we have in the domestic space is already so beautiful and so sacred and so well done that it does not require any change, which is of course absolute nonsense, but there it is. That's the proposition. The proposition amongst the laboring poor can't be that. Their domestic circumstances are so awful that they must be changed. And so they're looking for education, political power, whatever they can have access to change the conditions both inside and outside the home. In that sense, these are the subjects of world history. These are the people who are saying the future needs to be built, the good society needs to be built. And they're doing it in a very different way from the elites. So I do all of that, and I can speak to various sort of parts of this question. I just want to say the last thing that I try to do and do fairly carefully. What I do is I detail daily routines, habits, activities, especially of men in the home. And I return to this at the end of my book in a section. This is part 3 of the book. I have 3 parts. In part 3 of the book, I call it History in a Visceral Register. And in this 3rd part of the book, what I attend to is the things that men touched, the way they spoke, the moods they exhibited in the domestic space, and the things they did not touch, refused to do, right? And in some senses, the detail of that is astonishing, in part because there are several things that elite, middle class, upper middle class, comfortable homes, the men in these homes, there are things that they refuse to do, which working class men also refuse to do. So there's a peculiar way in which the social revolution that working class people are actually calling for stops short at this notion of the self-respect of men and men's need to be men, if you like. And so what I do is I pay close attention to those daily acts or in doing, in speaking, and in behavior in terms of moods. And through that, I talk about how it must have felt to be there in those ordinary circumstances, in those ordinary relationships. And I put it to you, especially those students and others who may be thinking of themselves as historians, people who will in the future write about things, think about things. I put it to you that history's claim upon us must be, ultimately history must be a statement, an attempt to grasp what it feels like to be there. What did it feel like to be there then, in those circumstances, in that relationship, for different people involved in the same relationship? One thing I do, like Shapna, I talk about, I use autobiographies a great deal, and I use them even more than her because there really is such a colossal amount. You can go to all sorts of other things, but I've gone to the autobiographical, fictional as well as non-fictional writings as my main source. And I've juxtaposed men's and women's writings about the same experiences, the same home, the same life lived and shared with the other person writing an autobiography. And it is astonishing how different those two, the men's accounts and the women's accounts, are of what that life was, what the shared life was, what was expected of them, what was denied to them, what it felt like to be there. And finally, I just probably should say, since this is just carrying forward what Ren and Shapna have done in their thing, I hold back for a moment on the formulations of masculinity and manliness and patriarchy. I don't want to start with those formulations. Therefore, I start the book and focus very categorically on something as mundane as men, their being, their behavior, their presence, absence in the home. So starting with that inquiry, that frame, as that phrase as the object of inquiry, actually throws up rather interesting things about masculinity and reinforced patriarchy and, changes in all of these, pretending not to be changes, which the others have spoken about so beautifully. I should stop there, probably because, you've got three different people's presentations, and the two before me have a great deal of detailed books already there to discuss. And I'd be happy to try and respond to anything that did not, and many things would not have come through in this very broad sweeping statement that I've made. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Professors Pandey, Pepitone, Kanji. We'll now open the floor to questions. We have about 10 minutes or so. So I can try to move the mic. But any questions?
Can we do the camera? Yeah, Professor Nancy.
Thank you all for such wonderful talks. I'm interested in this phrase, history in a visceral register. I think it's a beautiful phrase. I'm interested for all of you, even though it's been coined by one of you. I'm interested in how you have navigated doing that responsibly, I guess I would say, right? All of you are dealing with things that are between the lines of texts. And so how have you used space, let's say, in the Inns of Court, or how have you used the things that these men touched, or how have you used sort of pedagogical sociality, right, beyond text, to get at this visceral register?
Let Professor Pandey respond first because he has waited, and I would like to take this opportunity to introduce Professor Mancia to everyone who's actually working on the performative and the registers of performance, of change, of what history, how history feels like. And she's, are you offering a course now or the next semester?
Next semester.
Next semester, she's offering a course. She trained herself. She can talk more about it, but let's tackle her question first. Professor Pandey, if you could please respond.
Thanks, Shapna. And I'm sorry I didn't get the questioner's name. Professor Mancia?
Mancia, yeah.
Okay. Thank you for your question. And Shapna, please call me Gyan, since I'm calling you Shapna. All right. Professor Mancia, I want to say, it is of the visceral register is something that I say in the book is very difficult to touch.
Yeah.
So touch is very difficult to touch. but I say categorically that we must try. We must at least raise the question. And once we raise the question, we open up the possibility of others registering, seeing history in that visceral register. What I do in rounding up the book, and though it runs right through, I do a couple of different things. And I'll just give you two instances of this. One is I try to catalog the things, the kinds of acts that men were willing to do, the things they touched, even literally. What are the things? Do they touch beds? Do they make beds? They touch them because they sleep on them. They certainly don't make them, right? Do they touch food? Yes, of course, they eat food, but they never cook it, right? Do they touch women? Yes, of course they touch women for sex. Rarely their emotions, rarely other things. So in that sort of way, I try to make a list almost of the things that men touched and did not touch. And then I catalog the kinds of speech acts, the way in which women are addressed, servants are addressed, and the way in which women have to address the men. And I try and catalog the moods that the restlessness, the frustration, the rage sometimes, the boredom that men exhibit in the home, which women are very rarely allowed to exhibit in any sort of way. And the poor and the marginalized are not allowed, etc. And then I'll just say in reverse that women very often write in their autobiographies. Autobiographies written quite often in hero to, as valedictory statements, wonderful statements about well-known men who had done wonderful things in the public sphere. They write in those autobiographies about how they worshipped their husbands, but their husbands have tortured them, and they use this in anguish. They address private letters sometimes to their husbands, saying, Swami, Lord, my husband, you are my everything to me, and yet you torture me by demanding this, that, the other, not understanding all the pressures upon me. It's that kind of thing. It's the detail which is mundane. It's absolutely, every day. And I just want to repeat that the working class men, too, refuse to cook. They do all sorts of other things. They refuse to cook. They don't clean the bottoms of their children, all sorts of things. And the women occasionally will articulate that. Will say, who woke up all through the night while the children were puking? You were sleeping, like when you call them your children, right? So that's the way in which I try to do it. I think with all these books, the detail is actually, because it is detail that is not attended to. The detail is vital, and that's where we get to the visceral register. But the broader frame helps, and thank you for your question.
Thank you. Ren?
I'll speak briefly because I think I exceeded my time when I was speaking up there. But I would say that I tried to get at it by thinking about, similarly to Gyan, looking for what's repeated as quotidian detail, but then also where, again with the spatial focus, where bodies are maybe out of the spaces that they're expected to be in, where things stand out, or affective registers step out of the norm. So where are moments of anger, of rupture, and so yeah, I will kind of leave it there, but that's the method.
So first I want to comment on Gyan's format of the book. I think he's making a major methodological intervention in the way he had beautifully laid this out. And one of the strengths, like spectacular aspect of the book is that he let the sources speak. So you really see the visceral registers throughout the book, not just in one chapter, but spread throughout. As far as I am concerned, I also deal with the everyday and the ordinary, and inside what was playing inside also had ramifications in the larger nationalist world and vice versa. So in one of my chapters, I just don't talk about imagining children, but I also have how children imagine their fathers. And I use the word imagined, it's built on predominantly autobiographical sources. And in that chapter, I basically engage with Victorian notions of manliness and fatherhood. And they show how Victorian, all these men that we talked about, that I discussed in my work, to an extent, Gyan also addressed the following generations who emerged out of this deeply steeped Victorian values. I show how men, as fathers, became more hands-on parents. So they have changed from their prior generations of very strict, tyrannical fathers, as described in Victorian England, but they have become much more, amenable. Their punishments were not as brutal, or they were reflecting upon those fathers that, they went to the extremes of physical chastisement. So, and I have shown how those fathers were, playing dolls with their children, or, making them, feeding them milk, taking care of them, taking out to places, but at the same time maintaining their boundaries as the absent father sometimes, as a distant father sometimes. So overall, all three of our works, although we look at different contexts, they actually show, a continuity and then a departure from prior norms, particularly of gentlemen, what constituted gentlemen, what constituted manliness for these respectable generations, and what will constitute the future generation.
Thank you so much. We have time for maybe 2 more questions from the audience.
You can introduce yourself.
Hello, hi. My name is Rashmi, and I'm a graduate student at the Graduate Center CUNY, and I'm also a GTFA and I teach here in Brooklyn College. And I have a question for Professor Pandey, and I had the opportunity to attend your book talk in Columbia last year, where you discussed at length what you're doing in your book.
Excuse me, I'm sorry. You'll just have to speak up a little bit.
Yeah, okay. Hello, hi. My name is Rashmi. I'm a student of Professor Banerjee, and I'm teaching world history here in Brooklyn College. And I had the opportunity to attend your talk in Columbia University last year, where you discussed your book at length, like what you're doing in your book. And so you're arguing that men in whom, like across social and in South Asia, across social classes and caste, they asserted their authority or their constitutional masculinity through their role as fathers and husband, right, in home. So I wanted to know, like, if you're also looking at men in the matrilineal household, especially in South Asia, and how did they assert masculinity in a matrilineal familial space, like, yeah.
I'm sorry, that last part I missed. Just repeat that last part, please.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Better.
Okay.
I hear it, it just breaks up a little bit.
Okay. How did men in matrilineal familial spaces asserted masculinity, where they were like, there was a concept of fatherhood, there was like uncles who were playing the part of father in the household, but husbands were mostly missing in the matrilineal household, especially in South Asia, like Naya families. So how do you study those men in those spaces?
Shapna or Ren, could one of you please just...
She's
problem
asking
about
fathers in matrilineal households, such as in Kerala, right?
Yeah, like the Naya family.
How men in matrilineal households, for example, in Kerala, they assert their masculinity. That's her question.
Okay. Thanks, and the short answer is you will have to answer that question. For the simple reason that I certainly do not write about every part of the country. I do not have the language skills, I don't have the knowledge, the ability to work in many of these areas. My book is very much concerned with northern, central, and western India, and with many people who moved to Pakistan when India and Pakistan became independent. But it looks in those areas at different groupings, which themselves are fairly remarkably differentiated, and comes up with propositions about that. I quite deliberately focus on the heterosexual husband and wife relationship, the heteronormative, in northern, central, and western India, because that's the one that's idealized in colonial and post-colonial India, and in much of the modern world. And, as I said, in this election too, and in the Indian election, in many, many parts of the world, this is the kind of ideal, the kind of demand that is being reinstituted. If the working class examples that I gave have anything to tell us, then I suspect the fact of matrilineal will not lead automatically to men acting very differently, doing many more things in domestic space. But it's an important question to think, what is the relationship where power or inheritance goes through women, right? And what is it that is left to men as their privilege and their leisure time, and their ability to not do things in the domestic world. But I really don't know about the Kerala situation any better than that. But
Thank you all so much. So we're at about time. And Professor Pandey, students are getting ready for their next set of classes. So if you see people, walking past, that's what's happening here at Brooklyn College. So thank you, all three of you, all for a wonderful conversation. As you said, it was, this happy accident, right? All of these three books, all very much flowing from each other. And of course, gender as that central category of analysis there. So thank you all. Thank you, students. Thank you, faculty, for bringing your students.
Thank you, Alia. Thank you, Alia. I hope this is the beginning of a very important conversation. We are already part of an ongoing dialogue that's going on at Brooklyn College. And I hope that we will continue on with this conversation.